Everyone's faces, and we appreciate folks joining, members of the public online. Thank you so much to JD and Susan for joining us. We are delighted that JD is officially our second liaison. So recognizing that JD's been involved in this work for, you know, all the way back, having you engaged as our formal liaison is definitely going to be a exciting new chapter. And we've got a case to review tonight. We've got some administrative details to get through, so we'll go ahead and jump in. But before I do, JD, is there anything you want to say just to?
Yes, thank you, Julie. And I know my colleague Susan Cunningham is also on the call. Maybe best if we go ahead and just give some opening remarks. But as you stated, Julie, and to everyone, to all the commissioners, to our IPA, to the public, I'm excited to be here. This is, of course, my first meeting officially as the board liaison to the Community Oversight Board. Um, let's just say this for those that have been following this process, the Community Oversight Board, from its inception, you would know that I had my hands all in the creation of this Community Oversight Board when it was just perhaps an idea in the community. And I'm happy to see where we are today. I have been tracking a lot of the work. My first year on the board, however, we had designated liaisons, so I was a bit hands off, but you can best believe that this year I will be laser focused on a number of the issues that you have been talking about over the years and figuring out ways to get to yes and also moving the needle. One thing about me is I'm a very results oriented leader, perhaps like many of you are. But time is of the essence. There is probably going to be some issues, of course, in areas that's going to require larger scale conversation. There are some issues that are going to require perhaps even state legislation. But be it as it may, we will seize the moment as a community oversight board and do everything we can to ensure that we are moving at the pace of need, right? And I think the need is great for robust community oversight, and there's still a lot of work to be done, right? It's more to it than just reviewing allegations of wrongdoing and alike. It's a lot of nuance, and there's training involved, there's professional development involved, and I just want to commend each and every one of you for your time and attention since you've been on this board. I do have some background in investigations as a federal investigator back in the day, so I am though I'm not a lawyer, I am innately aware and kind of like read in on processes and procedures and how things work. So a lot of times, Charles is a lawyer here, and many of you are. I listen, right? I listen attentively to people's rationale, their thoughts, and then try to form an opinion and find a way ahead. So again, let's have fun. This year there are going to be perhaps some challenges, and with that being said, again, I'm excited, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Susan Cunningham, who's also with us here tonight. Great to see you all, and Happy New Year. I do have a little bit of the crud. You may hear this in my voice, but it's just going around, y'all. We'll be fine. It's not COVID.
Well, great. Well, I am delighted to be back with you guys for the year. And I know last year was like liftoff, and I think this year we're really gonna fly. So thank you all for, especially those who've been slogging since the beginning. I think we're getting to that point where it's hard to imagine how hard it was in the early days. Different challenges now, but as JD said, lots of legislative opportunities and just reminders every which way that the rule of law and the training and care that we expect of our law enforcement starts here at home and is challenged in brand new different ways every which way. And so it's just more important than ever that we make sure that our Arlington law enforcement teams can be as amazing as possible and learning as we go. So thank you all for the enormous amount of time and care that you put into this. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, JD. Thank you, Susan. We'll go ahead and jump in. Before I take attendance, I want to check if any of the folks who've joined by phone might be Anika. think maybe not. We'll wait. We expect she might be able to join us later. So I've
Oh, I'm
got.
sorry.
Oh, you're here.
Yeah.
Perfect. Excellent. Thanks, Anika. Okay.
Mhm.
Commissioner Montgomery, Commissioner McCullough, Commissioner Shelkin, Commissioner
Here.
Smith,
Here.
Commissioner Dansby,
Here.
Commissioner Evans, Chair Evans here, Commissioner Ortiz.
Here.
Wonderful. I love full attendance. We've got Mummy. I also want to introduce Rachel, who is working with us on some of our reporting activities. We've got her engaged to help us with some of the completed investigations that we haven't published reports yet for. So we've got one that's about to circulate and another one in process. And Dave and I are working on some of the more recent ones to kind of bookend. So hopefully we can, that's one of our goals for this year, is to have all the paperwork to go with this. So thanks, everyone. I just want to ask quickly, did anyone not have a chance to review the previous meeting minutes before today? Or does anyone need us to pull them up so they can look at them? Okay, Dave, I know you had put in a question about whether public comment was taken or not given. So with that stipulation that Ethan just amends that no public comment was received, then do I have a motion to approve the previous meeting minutes?
Also move.
Charles. Second, Charles.
Wonderful. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Wonderful. Any abstentions? Okay, perfect. Okay, I don't really have any chair updates for this evening. I know we've got some other kind of works in progress that we'll probably have more substantive updates for next week. But Mummy, I might just kick it over to you in case there's anything you want to cover.
If it's okay, I will save my report out till after we do the review, just because I know that some people may need to hop off early and it's more administrative and
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to set the stage here for this investigation, and then Joshua, who was my co-lead for this one, will help us kind of walk through the discussion. One thing we want to be sensitive to in discussion about this complaint is that this case does involve an allegation of sexual assault, and the complainant and alleged victim in this situation did not continue engaging with ACPD after a certain point in investigation and follow-up. And so to be respectful of their privacy, we have limited the circumstantial details that we'll talk about, recognizing that whether or not that person is kind of ready to just move forward and close that chapter, there were some concerns raised in our investigation review about ACPD's lack of follow-up, and that can represent an ongoing risk to public safety. So I'll give a high-level overview and let Joshua and Mummy chime in for any additional context that they want to share. Mummy?
Yes, thank you. Just for members of the public who may not be aware of the underlying circumstances. So just to be clear, it's an allegation regarding a failure to investigate a
Yes.
sexual assault, not a sexual assault involving an ACPD officer, which would be a whole other conversation. So I just wanted to clear that up so nobody's,
Misunderstand.
thinking that going into the discussion. And then additionally, you may notice that ACPD is not present at the meeting tonight. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of context to that so that people are aware of like the underlying reason for that and just in fairness to all participants. So Julie was referencing that this case has some particular sensitivities, and that's due to a Virginia Code section that protects the confidentiality of sexual assault victims. And so the reason why we always anonymize the participants in a complaint, but the reason why we are taking particular care to not go into a lot of details about the underlying relationship or any sort of personal details in this matter. So we'll be speaking in a little bit more general terms than normal, is because we don't want to run the risk of directly or indirectly identifying the complainant in respect to her privacy. Um, the Virginia Code section does allow for records to be shared and discussed more broadly if we got the written consent of the complainant or the victim in this case. We did get ACPD to agree to reach out to the victim to obtain her written consent, but she did not respond. And that's what Julie was referencing in terms of her decision not to engage, which we fully respect. And so in moving the conversation forward, we had a lot of discussions about how we wanted to handle the sensitivity of that and just take any extra precautions to preserve the confidentiality in this matter. And then ACPD was advised not to participate in the meeting because they are the ones who are directly liable for any sort of information being shared directly or indirectly, because they are the custodians of the records as the underlying law enforcement agency. So they didn't want to run the risk of, in answering questions or discussing the case, being responsible for disclosing any information. As a law enforcement body, we are not bound by the statute necessarily in the same way, but certainly we want to be conducting ourselves as, stewards of these records in a confidential manner, and being respectful of the sensitivity around that. So that's why we have these kind of extra protocols in place tonight. And I just wanted to kind of explain that and highlight this is part of a larger issue regarding records access. We are trying to propose and push forward legislation that is going to include civilian oversight agencies in the defined agencies that can have access to these records related to sexual assault victims or juveniles, so that when we do receive complaints that have that overlap into these subject matters, the police department is able to fully share records with us, which in this case, they were not able to share all the records with us that we would have liked to have. And that's, again, for the same reason as what I discussed in terms of their attendance. So that's just because of the way the law is written. Unfortunately, there's just some parts of the Virginia Code that haven't caught up to civilian oversight. It's a relatively new thing in Virginia. And so we just need to do a little housekeeping in the Virginia Code to make sure that civilian oversight agencies are in the listed agencies that are anticipated to be able to access these records, because certainly I think it is very much in the interest of the community for us to be looking into matters that involve sexual assault allegations or juveniles and things of that nature. So I don't think the intent is to exclude us from being able to participate in these sort of civilian oversight reviews. But as I said, the law hasn't quite caught up to the intent. And so we've been trying to navigate that over the last couple of months, and that's why we've had to keep deferring this meeting, because we've been just working through all of the kind of legal avenues to get us this discussion. But I'm confident that with consultation from council and all of the internal stakeholders, that we have come up with a protocol that is going to be in the best interest of the public, because we want to be as transparent as possible with you all about what happened here and what our recommendations were and what we discovered in the investigation, while also, making sure that we are, as I said, being judicious stewards of this information and respecting the complainant's confidentiality. I don't know if any of our county board members want to speak to any of that, or Julie or Dave or Joshua. I know that you all were part of the conversations. I tried my best to sum up all of the concerns all around.
Thank you,
I
Mummy.
Just one real quick thing, which I agree with everything you said, Mummy, and that is just to emphasize, though, that the COB did specifically reach out to our council to get guidance on what would be appropriate to discuss within the parameters of the Virginia state law that precludes disclosing information to indirectly identify the victim. So we've done that. We think that we're well within those boundaries, and we didn't push the question of written consent. The complainant did file a complaint about the ACPD response to the investigation. We didn't want to make an issue of, does that constitute written consent? On one hand, there's an argument, I think, to be made that it does, but we didn't push that because it's clear that ACPD and the COB want to appropriately both keep the victim's identity private and conform with the law. So I think we're doing that, but I appreciate the fact that you raised these other issues, because I think there are other issues that have tentacles that go elsewhere that we can follow up with as appropriate. That's it.
Joshua?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, excuse me, clarify, for those that just kind of heard the statement from Mummy, which was a good clarifying statement, that when we talk about a reference to a code or any kind of information sharing in our, attempts at being transparent in these meetings, I just want to be clear that those are, of course, as Mummy said, the internal kind of stakeholder things we're working through and we're committed to working through. But where you hear somebody said, oh, it's because this law, that's not necessarily a matter of fact. That's just somebody's perspective at this point. And what I just mean to clarify that is, for example, my personal opinion is there is no law that would prevent the COB from obtaining materials that we wanted to here. But we are working that out with our colleagues in ACPD and the county. But that's just kind of what we mean is these are the structures, the kind of things that we're dealing with that everybody's looking at, and they of course have to address it kind of with their counsel and their colleagues, and we're going to work through it. We're committed to working through it. But it's not a matter of those are absolute bars. It's just a matter of those are perspectives and kind of the difficulties that we're working through. But just that clarification. So I don't want somebody to think that that is per se kind of the roadblock here.
Yeah, and I would just add, as Mummy pointed out, the code would it be helpful if the code gets clearer and catches up with us so that everyone can be comfortable. And we certainly are working hard on that, hoping that the legislative session just started this week, and hopefully they will consider and maybe get it through this year. But I just want to give a shout out to all of you, to IPA, to COB, and then also to ACPD that are not on today, for kind of wading through these slightly, new adventures and working through making it clearer. So we're getting there, but there's definitely still a lift ahead, and I appreciate the extreme creativity and persistence to make sure that we can continue to do work and move things forward while we get everything a little bit tidier and cleaner going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the
Yeah.
kind of additional context. JD?
Sure. Trying not to be repetitive, but I'll just kind of regurgitate, bring up what I said earlier. I know that this particular area of interest and has been one that, again, it's not new, right? And so it's been discussed within this commission for an extended period of time, and just know that we are, again, working hard to see what we can do in this legislative session to do what's necessary to adjust legislation as appropriate. We always want to err on the side of caution and protect folks' identity and be mindful of all of that. I get it. But there comes a point in time, right, where we are going to have to figure out a way to find solutions to these problems. And this in and of itself is very problematic. And again, it prohibits, I think, the COB and the IPA, quite frankly, from really doing the robust work and engagement that's needed in this level of investigation. So we're working it. We're on it, and this is a high priority, I think, for the board and also for a lot of folks on this call. So thank you very much.
Thanks, team. So just to kind of, for anyone who may be new to our kind of case review, we will step through kind of a summary of the incident, the events leading to the complaint, and then in this instance, a little bit more information about what did and did not take place in ACPD's investigation. We'll highlight relevant policies so that you all can see and have the context for, when a complainant alleges a violation, when a complainant, whether it's to ACPD or through the IPA and COB's complaint intake system, lodges the complaint, then ACPD in their investigation identify relevant policies to review whether or not policy violations took place. In a lot of cases, the COB or IPA, put forward other possible policy violations for consideration, which is the case here. And then we will look at the investigation outcome. So as a refresher, the Office of Professional Responsibility within ACPD does a concurrent investigation with Mummy as the independent police auditor into the events that the actions ACPD took related to the incident. And then Joshua and I will present our recommended findings for those individual policy violation allegations. And then the COB will discuss kind of the different aspects of the case. So because this is a little bit nuanced and we want to be mindful of privacy, we'll kind of go through all of the top level things, let you guys ask. I'll have Mummy and Joshua add any additional context, and then we'll walk through each alleged policy violation one by one, keeping in mind that our discussion is not to be punitive or to figure out, what could have been improved, although we often get into that in discussion. Our goal here is to help ACPD understand what they can be doing to conduct themselves to improve public trust. In this case, again, as we mentioned, there are implications for public safety if we don't investigate allegations of, violent crimes, and then our recommendations to improve accountability. So we'll go ahead and get started. I've taken the timeline out of this, but the first thing to understand is that this report was made several years after the alleged rape took place. The alleged perpetrator of the rape was the intimate partner of the complainant. And so they had been in a relationship for several years. And then there was an incident that took place several years ago. And then recently that complainant made a report to ACPD. And then after that made a complaint to ACPD and the IPA about how that complaint was handled. The complaint was that the subject officer made unprofessional comments to the complainant in the course of the investigation, and that ACPD failed. I've got a typo there, sorry. ACPD failed to properly investigate the complainant's report of rape. So the people involved here are really just the complainant, a member of the public, Officer 1, who was the detective assigned to investigate from the Special Victims Unit, and then Officer 2, who was her supervising officer that was consulted in the course of this. So the complainant reported that they'd been in a long-term intimate relationship with a former partner that included consensual BDSM activity, and that during one sexual encounter, which began consensually, that she withdrew consent while restrained, but that her partner continued that activity against her will. Years later, having left the relationship, the complainant reported this rape to ACPD, and as part of that report had provided an email from their former partner from the day after that incident was reported to take place. We'll get into a little bit more of that, but this case was assigned to the Special Victims Unit to be investigated, and the complainant had followed up with the detective that they'd been given a name for to investigate the allegation. In that conversation, the complainant reported that she had followed up several times and that it took several weeks to get in contact with the officer, and that once they did, asking about next steps, she was told that there would not be next steps because she stayed in the relationship. So the officer then, responded to the complainant. The complainant alleges that she told Officer 1 that, that analysis was victim blaming. And when the subject officer tried to kind of defend themselves in conversation, the complainant got frustrated and hung up. That the complainant hanging up on the officer led them to consult with their supervisor, in which there was a conversation about whether or not, this is a uncooperative witness, that Officer 1 was told that oftentimes, if you're not able to engage with the witness, that the case can be closed. So in this, the complainant later filed a formal complaint with OPR, with ACPD, with the Office of Professional Responsibility, alleging that ACPD had failed to properly investigate the rape allegation and that Officer 1 was unprofessional during their interaction. The detective said that after reviewing the materials, she did not believe elements of the Virginia law provisions for rape were met, and therefore did not proceed further with the investigation, including not contacting the alleged assailant. After the complainant hung up, Officer 1 emailed her supervisor to describe this interaction, and no further outreach to the complainant occurred. The supervising officer, when interviewed, told investigators that cases like this are sometimes marked inactive when a reporting party hangs up, and that pursuing an investigation with an uncooperative victim can be a judgment call. OPR concluded that officers' actions did not violate the department's personal contacts policy, which was one allegation, and that her handling of the matter was exonerated also under preliminary and follow-up investigations policy. No allegations were sustained by OPR's investigation, and no discipline was imposed. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. We had these slides. The other aspect of this that we registered during the investigation review was that neither officers conferred with the Commonwealth Attorney to determine kind of how to interpret that standard and what information could be gathered. Joshua?
I just wanted to clarify a statement that ACPD OPR specifically exonerated under the preliminary and follow-up investigations, but not sustained the personal contacts. I believe we said exonerated to go. So I just want to clarify that.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is the kind of list of alleged violations. The top two rows here are what was included in OPR's investigation. As I mentioned, oftentimes the IPA and or COB identify other policy considerations that we think were relevant to this case or to the case. In this case, supervisory responsibilities, the policies that guide supervisor behavior was not investigated by the Office of Professional Responsibility, nor was bias-free policing. And so you can see, as Joshua mentioned, that the OPR did not sustain the personal contacts violation against Officer 1, exonerated Officer 1 for preliminary and follow-up investigations, did not investigate the supervising officer's behavior in relation to this policy, or Officer 1's behavior with regards to bias-free policing. Mummy sustained both allegations in her report in the IPA's investigation and also against the supervising officer, but did not draw a conclusion about bias-free policing. And Joshua's and my kind of recommended findings here, which we'll get into kind of our thinking and the analysis that led us to these recommendations, are that the personal contacts violation against Officer 1 should be sustained, but that the preliminary and follow-up investigations not be sustained because of the conference with their supervisor, and that their supervisor endorsed the decision to treat the case as inactive and close the investigation, and that kind of culpability for this case outcome belongs with the supervisor who did not, for example, initiate a separate line of communication with the complainant to reestablish more constructive communication with a separate office, with a second officer, which is something ACPD has told us, has been done before, in field interactions. If communication breaks down with one officer, for whatever reason, that another officer, tried to establish communication as part of de-escalation. And we also did not draw a conclusion about bias-free policing. I guess I want to stop there and let Mummy and Joshua chime in with any additional context before we jump in. I think there are elements about credibility that we may want to talk about before we jump into the social context. There were the complainant also, in the course of this interaction with ACPD, had reported interactions that they'd had with other law enforcement agencies about this person and about this incident. And ACPD was not able to corroborate those claims, which led to a discussion about her credibility amongst ACPD, both within the officer's handling of the case initially and in the investigation of the complaint. I think that's all the details I had, but Joshua or Mummy, if there's anything you want to go back to or clarify.
I'll defer to you, Mummy, if you wanted to, I don't know, right now or later, talk about, Julie kind of gave the reason, our thinking for why we did not sustain the preliminary follow-up for Officer 1 and sustained for the supervisory you do have sustained for Officer 1 if you wanted to give kind of your rationale for that.
Yes. So on the preliminary and follow-up investigation, the way I can most simply put it is that a supervisor's input, if you go to them, is only as good as the homework that you've done or the information that you're giving them to give you input on. In this matter, first, let me just briefly touch on the email, because the email is really kind of the crux of this case for me. As Julie mentioned, the complainant filed this complaint with the SVU detective and reported that she had been sexually assaulted by her previous partner. After the alleged incident happened, the alleged assailant, or her former partner, sends an email to the complainant, which was unsolicited, like just on his own account. And the email, without getting to like the specifics of what is said in there, basically says, and as Julie mentioned, they're engaged in a regular BDSM relationship by which they, engage in consensual, up until this point, restraint mechanisms and different things like that. And again, without getting into all the details of their relationship, that piece is important because the alleged assailant, first of all, I think that's important because it gives context to why this case may not have been very black and white for the underlying detective who was investigating the case. So in fairness, I think that piece is important. But it doesn't, to me, excuse the need to, if something is unfamiliar to you, that to me is where you dig deeper instead of casting it aside. So in this situation, the detective, from what the evidence showed, spent more time investigating how long the complainant had been in the relationship, the nature of the relationship, the makeup and breakup, how long it had been since she reported it, the fact that they stayed together, the fact that she had interactions with other law enforcement agencies pertaining to her previous partner. And while all of that may be informative, it's certainly not something that could cause you to dispose of the investigation altogether because of this email. The email, again, unsolicited from her previous partner, says basically, you were acting different last night during their interaction. You were fighting back particularly hard. And more or less, he says, if you think that you were raped, you weren't. Or if that's what you're into, that's not what was going on there. And so the detective perceives that as this is not an admission of rape, which is the email was given to the detective by the complainant saying like he admits to, sexually assaulting me. And so the detective gives it a pretty cursory look and said, this is not an admission of rape. Well, the email doesn't say, I sexually assaulted you last night, but it does say I didn't sexually assault you last night, which is very, at the very least, it should beg some more. It's a red flag. It's something that should cause you to interrogate a little bit more. And because I think it's fair to say that in the regular course of business, you don't typically send out emails telling people what you didn't do unless there is an allegation that you did that or a thought that that may be what that person interpreted as. So at the very least, we don't know in this situation what happened one way or another. But what we're trying to encourage here is a baseline foundation where we believe the victim and then we investigate further into the allegations instead of investigating the victim and ignoring the allegations. And that's what happened here. Even if the detective had some underlying concerns about the potential motivations or credibility of the complainant, well, she doesn't quite phrase it that way, but it's, the statement of you stayed in the relationship and the links that she went to looking into her previous history with other law enforcement agencies. It's certainly the fact that more investigation resources went into looking into the complainant versus the alleged assailant. That in and of itself is a major problem. But even if you had issues related to the complainant's credibility, the email alone is a standalone factor that should raise some flags, with or without that. And that was completely ignored. That is a piece of information that should have been taken to the supervisor and was not taken to the supervisor. The email that she sends to the supervisor is more or less, hey, just so you know, I talked to the complainant today. She was upset that I wasn't going to follow up on this investigation. She hung up on me. I will not be calling her again. Does not mention the email at all, and or what, factors went into making that decision. But it's basically like, hey, just I'm letting you know in case this woman files a complaint. And that's literally what is said in the email from the detective. So I am not willing to not hold that detective accountable. I also think, though, that the supervising officer is accountable, because if someone is coming to you with a question about why or about an investigation and the manner in which it was closed, and you at the very least have information that it was closed in a way that was unsatisfactory to the complainant as a community member, then the supervisor could have done their due diligence, first of all, just on a customer service level, to reach back out to that complainant and ask the follow-up questions if the line of communication had been broken from the detective. But the detective literally says, I will not be calling her back. The detective is also a seasoned SVU detective. It's not someone who's like brand new. However, this is, I think, maybe the first instance, in fairness, of a BDSM type, intimate sexual relationship. So honestly, I think everybody should have been asking more questions in this situation. But just as a supervisor, I certainly understand that when an employee comes to me, I'm going to be able to hopefully assume, especially if this person is seasoned, a certain level of baseline research. And then, but again, the buck stops with me, so I am responsible. And the policy for a supervising officer explicitly says that you are responsible for employees that report to you. And so, again, that the information that the supervisor can give in terms of signing off is very limited in a situation where they're not given accurate or not accurate, not full information. And that's because a full investigation was not done. So I think there's culpability or responsibility or a need for accountability on both ends. And the supervising officer in this matter, just for purposes of clarity, was interviewed, but only interviewed as a witness officer, not a subject officer. And I take issue with that as well, because I think that the supervising officer, as I said, is responsible in a different way, but also responsible. And I have brought this policy up, I think, in multiple investigations at this point. The supervisory officers policy, which is cited here, is 300.55. I'll put a link in the chat. But it is a policy that goes into detail about the responsibilities of a supervising officer. And so it is, if it is not being utilized to hold supervisors responsible, I'm not necessarily sure what the purpose of it is, other than to just inform supervisors of what their responsibility is. But the purpose of these policies is to, one, make officers aware of what their expectations are, but two, also, on this end of it, to hold them accountable to those policies. And so I think we're halfway there, but we're not fully there in terms of naming supervisors in these investigations. Obviously, circumstances differ, right? I'm not making a blanket statement that every time a supervisor is involved, that the underlying officer is also responsible, or that may mitigate their responsibility. I've certainly seen instances where an officer has absolutely no knowledge about a situation and goes to a supervisor and gets misdirected in some way, shape, or form. And also to say that supervisors do make mistakes, right? So this is not necessarily an indication that this person, does not need to be a supervisor or anything like that. I think this is more of a, and to OPR's credit, I will say, they did ask questions during this interview of the supervisor of like, what is the normal supervisory process for these types of cases in SVU? And the supervisor's response was, well, just due to the technical nature of our system, which they have upgraded their kind of internal kind of case management system, if you will, where when you provide an incident report or a supplemental report, a supervisor has to go in and approve that, which is a great, but it is more of a administrative checks and balance than it is a substantive review. And so some of the feedback that we talked about in that OPR was absolutely, receptive to and heard, was that, and I think it came out during the interview with the supervising officer as well, was that there needed to be, and there should always be, especially in cases that are in the special victims unit, which are, very serious, very sensitive cases, there should be a substantive review from the supervisor when an officer comes with questions. And then additionally, the Commonwealth attorney review that we recommended. But now I've gone all down the full gamut of issues in that lane of the preliminary and follow-up investigations. But I thought that I needed to kind of give a broader overview of what my reasoning and logic was to explain why I not only felt that Officer 1 should be sustained, but also that the supervising officer should be sustained. But to be clear, the supervising officer did not have any formal allegations brought against them in this investigation. They were only interviewed as a witness officer. So that is part of the issue from my end as well.
So I definitely want to jump into kind of the social context here, and kind of the different lenses we apply to these case reviews. But Joshua, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just very briefly. Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank Mummy for that. And, the reason why, of course, I think that additional context is helpful, is not only, of course, do you see not sustained recommendation from Julie and I here, and you saw a sustained recommendation from Mummy. So I wanted you guys to understand that. I thought it was reasonable the first time that Mummy kind of talked about it. Frankly, I think we got that email from Officer 1 to her supervisor yesterday or maybe Monday night. So my point is, I'm still kind of on the fence about it, so far as whether I'm convinced. But kind of to what Mummy is saying, I think that my inclination is, if you have any kind of employee that goes to a supervisor and is at least comprehensive enough to tell them what the issue is, that probably, once you endorse, probably belongs to the supervisor. If there's a situation more like this where, to Mummy's point, not all of this told, or maybe there's enough there from that person's individual duty or individual's experience that would prompt more from them on kind of a separate degree angle than just from supervisory, then it's reasonable. But I think that was a good recap, but I just wanted everybody to hear that because frankly, I think that both are kind of reasonable ways to think about it. But no, I won't hold this up anymore.
And to that point, I probably should have caveated this at the beginning. We had a little bit of difficulty with our accounts accessing some of the evidence between when the COB received Mummy's report and the meeting. So we are not going to hold a vote tonight as part of our kind of good faith effort, or our good faith agreement with ACPD, but also, amongst ourselves, that a lot of times taking in this evidence and information, it's a lot to take in, the circumstances, all the nuance. And so we decided, we have had to postpone hearing this, reviewing this case for a while, and we wanted to follow up and kind of keep things moving, but we don't want to rush to a conclusion. And so we will not hold a vote on these findings until our February meeting, so that members of the COB who got access to information more recently through no fault of ACPD's, just our own kind of account login access issues, make sure that there's time to just kind of sit with the different aspects of this. So I do want to jump into relevant social context. A lot of times we talk about, the COB's purpose and mission is to increase public trust between ACPD and the broader community, and that one of the facets of this is the third party perspective. So we have to consider, what the view looks like from the complainant, who called to report a rape and felt like she was treated unprofessionally and blamed, and that there was not enough follow through for her investigation. We have to look at the consideration from the officer's perspective about, what information they were looking at and what facts they had to go on. One element was that, the ACPD Office of Professional Responsibility said it is typical, for example, not to follow up with, for example, the alleged assailant because they had not yet conferred, they had not finished conferring with the complainant. But that lack of follow-up is consistent with what Mummy was pointing to about, more energy went into investigating the relationship than the crime. And so the other lens we want to bring to this is that, failing to investigate violent crimes does, expose the public to a possible, ongoing safety risk. And so looking at the factors here under consideration, that this that these dynamics, whether it's intimate partner violence, whether it's, situations with withdrawn consent, whether that's BDSM or role play, or, in marital relationships, right, that there is a lot of data, we have to understand that, for example, many abuse victims, including, in different forms of intimate partner violence, do remain in abusive relationships for reasons outside of their own control. That can be financial, it can be logistical, it can be fear of safety and retaliation. And so not only is it, not atypical for a victim of intimate partner violence to stay in a relationship, but also to not report until after they leave the relationship. So the fact that this was reported years later does not lend any, impact to evidence about whether or not whether or not a rape occurred. There is no statute of limitations on rape in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And similarly, that the predetermined conclusions, like how much energy went into investigating the circumstances of their relationship, rather than, questions about how did you communicate that, consent was withdrawn, and, what happened after that to evaluate whether or not it met the standard of, Virginia's statutory considerations for rape. So there definitely seemed to us to be this kind of potential for minimization, victim blaming, and shifting the focus away from the offender and onto the victim. ACPD did not ever engage with the alleged perpetrator to just have a conversation about, why did you send this email? What do you remember from that night? Do you remember any of these, events recounted? Like, we don't have information about whether or not a rape occurred. What we're looking at here is whether or not that was properly investigated. And in the evidence that we reviewed, there is not evidence that contradicts the rape allegation themselves. So it's one thing to say, I I'm alleging that my, partner abuses me. Also, they're drunk and they're bad at their job, right? Those two things might not be true, and I still could have been abused, right? And so looking at, how we can encourage ACPD to look at these kinds of instances where, again, we also know that rape cases go underreported. We know that they face a high level of attrition, particularly that cases drop out during the police investigative stage because of the way that problematic attitudes make them feel, whether it's, explicit victim blaming or just that lack of kind of compassion and support. And that's going to get into some of our recommendations. But like, it's not that these are easy situations, it's that these are special victims unit detectives that are, that specialize and are meant to be equipped to handle this kind of dynamic. And so, taking into account the broader social context, it did seem like, we did not have enough of an investigative effort to test the allegation of whether or not a crime occurred, and that the lack of corroboration by other jurisdictions, whether that's because they said that the other jurisdictions may have said, we have no records of this. They may have said, we were not able to corroborate that. But we can't also assume that they didn't also possibly have, some of those failures. So that lack of evidence about, these other claims that were made by the complainant, whether they were true or not, still do not have any bearing on evidence about whether or not the rape itself took place. So we're going to transition to looking at oh, I'm sorry. I mean, did you have your hand up? Did you
No,
want
that's
to add
okay.
something here before we jump in?
No, you hit the last point that I was going to just raise, which was the fact that there were multiple other agencies that were involved. Certainly, that is, again, informative, but we've seen many instances, some that have played out in the national media, where there are several agencies across several states of FBI involvement, where allegations are made, and it's not until years later, after hundreds of victims, that it is taken seriously. And so that to me, it is information, but what I kept asking myself here is like, what is the cost of reaching out to the alleged assailant and ask, like you said, asking more questions about the email, and how did that outweigh the benefit of that outweighed all of the factors that were, that we spent a lot of time on and talking about in this investigation, but none of them are outweighing the need to get more information in that regard. So, yeah, I just wanted to plus one that, what we learned from this relationship, or from this investigation rather, is that we want to be taking that social context and educating. The purpose of this investigation, the purpose of this conversation is more education around the nuances of these types of relationships, and that people who are in relationships that are abusive, can take time to report, that these relationships are nuanced. They may stay in the relationships for a certain period of time. And none of that negates the fact that there may still be an underlying sexual assault allegation. And so that these are all things that we talked about in terms of how we implement that education into training and do this differently in the future with the police department. And then
Thank
also
you.
wanted to make sure that we circle back to the other policy conversations. It looks like that's the next slide. So I'll wait for that.
I'm going to let Joshua kind of step us through here in our individual thinking of, what is the policy language? What were the relevant circumstances? What did OPR find? What did the IPA find? And how did we come to our recommendation? Joshua, I'll just plus one your point that, looking at the email more recently, I have, I think it's worth discussion about the preliminary and follow-up recommendation before we kind of finalize that. But I'll let you kind of step through this if you're comfortable with that.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, personal context, Officer One, again, just for everybody's context, this was one of the ones that OPR did investigate, one of the policy violations they did investigate. Again, the kind of root of this, as you could kind of see, there we go, on the left, the relevant policy language. I won't exactly really read it to you, but ultimately it comes down to interactions, right? How is ACPD and their officers interacting with the public in these engagements? And of course, obviously, we have to be professional, we have to be respectful, all those kind of things. OPR found, as you see at the bottom left, not sustained. Mummy and IPA found sustained. Julie and I, as the leads on this, recommend sustained for COB. It really comes down kind of to that highlight that you'll see on the top right there, and kind of these other interactions where you say, hey, you go weeks as the allegation, trying to follow up after they say that it's been assigned to an officer. You're like, hey, where's the officer? Can I talk to them? Let's investigate this. You get the officer on the line. You have, I won't again repeat it, but kind of that conversation that I think kind of really devolved to a point that's like, hey, what are these next steps? No next steps. You stayed, right? You stayed in the relationship after what you're alleging happened, including rape and kind of this other stuff. And the question, is looking at the relevant policy language. Do we think that is unprofessional? Do we think that is respectful conduct? Things like that. We think not. So that is why our recommendation is sustained. OPR, to be fair to them and their findings, I believe the rationale is that, and again, obviously they're not here, so they'll have to forgive me, but good faith effort, not sustained for them. They didn't ask Officer One if she said that. They asked Officer One if the fact that somebody stayed in a relationship would have a bearing on their investigation, to which they replied no. Again, this could be me. I am an attorney by training. There's a difference between asking somebody what they would or should have done and what they did. And I found it a little disturbing that you never asked. To put it in kind of simple math terms to me, we have an allegation, which is at least some evidence by a complainant that something did happen, and you didn't take the time to refute it because you didn't ask them if they didn't say it. If it was a kind of she said scenario, this may be a little bit closer to me, but obviously that was that statement. And then you also have the other kind of interactions around there, kind of the allegations, so if they're not refuted of the time it took to reach out to his complainant, but also I don't want to duplicate it, but kind of the lack of follow-up and how the other parts of the interaction were handled, not just a statement, led us to recommend sustaining. So that's kind of where Julie and I came down on that one.
I just want to add one consideration here, because of why I think OPR came to this finding, and this came up in our kind of prep discussions with them, but that, not sustained, just to kind of go back to our definition, does not exonerate the employee, but it does, here, I think, point to the fact that in the interviews with Officer One, she said she did not remember saying that about, staying in the relationship, but that, generally when we're looking at respectful treatment, especially in these situations. And, this is where, we welcome discussion with the larger group. You know, the breakdown in communication that took place leading the complainant to hang up. We don't have a transcript of that call. We can only sort of speculate about what happened, but that, if a community member calls in to report a violent crime and the conversation does not go constructively enough to facilitate a full and meaningful investigation, that it is respectful to, have somebody else follow up to continue that conversation. And that didn't happen here. And so, there's a couple of different ways of looking at that conclusion, but that ultimately it does not feel like this complainant was treated with respect, even in the early stages, to sustain the engagement between ACPD and, an alleged victim of a violent crime, in order to take the investigation to a place where we would have more information about whether or not a crime likely took place. But because communication broke down so early in that, dynamic, it does seem to me like Officer One's interactions with the complainant did not demonstrate a professional and respectful treatment of somebody who is alleging to have experienced something very traumatic. So like Joshua said, our recommended finding here is sustained. Before we move on to the other kind of policy, alleged policy violations, I want to see if members of the COB have questions.
I have just some brief comments on it. I mean, and I have thoughts on the whole underlying matter, but on the particular question of personal contacts, what persuades me is the last sentence, and this is something that Mummy brought out in her report, under the policy, which is the personal biases or attitudes of the employee must not influence their decision to take police action. And I say that because I think that ACPD would have been well served, and the public, to have looked at this under the bias policy as well. That's another longer issue that needs further discussion in a different context. But I do think that ultimately Officer One had a view of this scenario that was kind of a biased view. And as a result of that, Officer One did not take necessary and appropriate police action, as opposed to the actual way that Officer One interacted with the complainant, which I don't know exactly what it was. We only have, a brief interview with Officer One recounting that, and a very short telephone call with the complainant that we've had access to. So, I mean, and my point is that it's very possible that the complaining witness got very upset at what Officer One said, because Officer One had basically made up her mind and was calling the complaining witness to say, I've reviewed your online, allegation of rape, and it doesn't meet the statute. And in that aspect, maybe she wasn't rude, maybe she was just being matter of fact, but that's totally inappropriate for her to have said that. So maybe it's the same thing that Joshua, you and Julie are saying. Long and short of it is, I do think that it should be sustained, but maybe on a slightly different basis, on the basis that she was essentially biased in finding that the online complaint of rape did not meet the statute, which I don't understand, because there's no way, unless the complaining witness said, everything that happened to me was consensual. And we don't have access to the online complaint, but there's no way that the complaining witness said that. There's no way. I mean, she said, presumably, I was raped. And this is the issue of withdrawn consent. And while both Officer 1 and Officer 2, looking at their interview, are thoughtful, reasonable people, I don't think that the way that this was handled, this unique situation of withdrawn consent, was up to the standards that, as a member of the public, I would want ACPD to be at. So I just feel like she had it in her mind that this was a very difficult case. It wasn't going to be provable. But for her to say, I decided based on the online complaint that what you allege does not meet the elements of rape, it doesn't make sense. There was no issue about the physical activity of rape. There was no question of whether it was digital penetration or something else. She basically said in the interview, the only element that was not met was the element of against the complainant's will. If the complainant says it was against my will, that's it. You have to do an investigation to find out what are the facts around that. And very quickly, I think it would be reasonable, and I would even say that this would be a very difficult case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But that's the point. That is not the decision for ACPD to make. That's a decision that's made in connection with the Commonwealth's attorney. And I want my police department to investigate this and to get all the facts, and then make a decision as to whether the case should be brought to a jury or not. But they didn't investigate it. And literally, the complaining witness, on the interview with ACPD as part of the complaint, said that the call was 1 minute. Now, I don't know if it was in fact 1 minute or a little bit longer, but there's no evidence to the contrary. I don't recall in the interview of Officer 1 or Officer 2 that they said how long the call was with Officer 1 to the complaining witness, but the complaining witness said it was a minute. So a 1 minute call, or let's say even 2 minute call, in which Officer 1 says, hey, I'm here to inform you that there are not going to be any next steps and that the allegation you raised doesn't meet the elements of rape. Of course, the witness is going to be upset. So to call the complaining witness uncooperative isn't really fair. Officer 1 went on to say, it was a little bit unclear. Officer 1 said, I had made the decision essentially that this was not a rape. And in fact, Officer 2 also said he didn't think that the telephone operator should have taken the case, which is astonishing to me. Like, the complaining witness called the police and said, I've been raped. Yes, it was 7.5 years ago, but Officer 2 also said that's not uncommon. And so that shouldn't be an issue either way.
And there's no statute of limitations.
Right. And the complaining witness calls, and yet Officer 2 said, I didn't even think that the telephone operator should have taken the complaint. That is crazy. I mean, unless the person is saying an alien came and raped me, or something completely crazy, but that's not what happened. Yes, this was a unique situation. Yes, it's in a unique context. It's all about withdrawn consent, but that's a question of proof. And I cannot believe that the complaining witness said, everything that happened to me throughout the entirety of the event was consensual, because she's complaining that she was raped. So by definition, she's saying it wasn't consensual. So you have to find out, what are the facts behind this? A 1 minute call in which Officer 1 says, I'm telling you, it doesn't meet the definition. Of course, the complaining witness is going to be upset. And then Officer 1 did say, well, I didn't want to call her back to find out more because I didn't want to be subjected to her verbal abuse. Again, Officer 1 seemed like a thoughtful, reasonable person, and I'm sure that they do a good job with most of these cases, but that's not an okay answer to say that, I mean, you're not being verbally abused by a complainant. It's a different situation than an uncooperative witness, in my mind, because here the complaining witness was upset at what the decision already was being conveyed to her. So that's how I see the case. I mean, it was a little bit more than I wanted to say all at one time, but anyway,
Well,
so.
Dave, we'll get in more to the personal biases kind of look when we look at bias-free policing, but because that language is in here, the other thing I just want to emphasize about what you said is we can only speculate about Officer 1's attitudes. It was not really investigated, right? Like, how did you come to this conclusion? But what we can look at is the lack of other factual information collected about the the alleged rape itself, right?
Right.
Like there's information about the
Zero.
relationship and the circumstances and blah, blah, blah. But there is not information that ACPD sought out about confirming, just basic facts around this, element here, including any engagement. And so, we don't know what those personal biases or attitudes are, but what we can say here is that there is the lack of information that would be expected in an investigation of a specific crime not being there show that there was some preconceived notion corroborated by a lot of the comments, you're saying from both the interview and kind of these interactions that like, again, some of this is speculative, but a lot of it is based on the information that was not collected by ACPD. Mummy?
Thank you. Really great points brought out by everyone. I will try not to be repetitive. I just wanted to kind of parse this down a little bit, because I do think in some aspects there are elements of the two policies that were investigated, personal context and failure to investigate, that kind of overlap, like the justification for each. But I think it was the way that I would most simply put it is the what is the failure to investigate, and the why is the personal context. But I think for the why, the bias-free policing policy would have been a better, more substantive way to look at the why. It was my recommendation that we use bias-free policing as the allegation, or both, and then let the investigation kind of, tell us, dictate which one was a more appropriate finding. But OPR decided to move forward with the personal context, and I think that's because of the underlying kind of framing of the discussion as kind of rude and unprofessional, which, honestly, I didn't feel that in listening to the interview. Obviously, it wasn't a recorded call, right? So it's one person's perception over the other person's recollection. And to be fair, this was a conversation that an administrative interview that we had with the detective, I think 2 years or so after the conversation with the complainant happened. And so she, I think, in fairness, may not have recalled exactly what she said, which is why in my report, I refer to them as alleged and admitted statements, right? Like she might have said certain things a certain way, may not have recalled how she said it, but certainly we know that the way that it was received by the complainant was such that it caused her to hang up on the detective. Obviously, we know that, let me just say this, I did not find beyond a preponderance of the evidence, of information that would lead me to think that the detective was intentionally necessarily trying to be rude, but that's not the end of the analysis. If it was, I might have gone not sustained. The intent and the impact of the statement are not one and the same. And so while the question may have been, or the response may have been just answering the question of why am I not following up with this investigation, it is also true that under no circumstances that I can imagine, making the alleged statement that the reason why they're not going to follow through with an investigation is because someone stayed in a relationship was going to be received in a positive light. And so, but really what I lean on is the statement that Dave pulled out, which is the personal biases or attitudes of the employee must not influence their decision to take police action other than what is justified or expected within the constraints of discretion. As I've stated several times on this call, there's no circumstance under which I would be convinced that following up with that email should not have taken place. And so whatever was said on that call, whatever the intent was on the call, the fact of the matter is that police action was not taken. And the why for me is indicative of a bias towards all of these factors that were named, the length of time, the fact that she stayed, X, Y, and Z, whatever the reasons were, they weren't because of the facts and circumstances that were investigated, because an investigation wasn't done. It is similar to, and I'll just say this on the point of like that it overlaps a little bit, right? The inquiry is not enough for me to say that an investigation was not done thoroughly. When an investigation is not done thoroughly, beyond a certain level of what is reasonable, right? Like we're not here when we look at investigations to fine toothpick what a detective did or didn't do in their investigation. It's not our job to retroactively, pick apart an investigation. was it a objectively reasonable, thorough job done here? And when you have an instance similar to the investigation that we reviewed, where the next of kin was not notified when Mr. Thompson's body was discovered, right? Unresponsive in the parking lot. Despite the fact that we had all this information pointing to the fact that he had next of kin, the detective didn't take the steps. Well, here we have an email that's glaring that you should have followed up on and you refuse to do so. So when it rises above a certain level of a failure to investigate, it should cause all of us to ask why. And that's why I think the additional allegation behind the why, that whether it's personal context or bias-free policing, is necessary. And I think that is a practice that we should continue, and we should keep moving the ball forward on really calling it what it is or investigating it for what it appears to be. Even if someone doesn't say on the call, I think the detective was biased. You know, you can look at the four corners of this complaint and you should ask yourself, like, why weren't these steps taken given the information that was presented? So I just wanted to say that's why I think it was important to have separate allegations, and why I think the bias-free policing was a probably more expensive or a better way to approach this inquiry. And the one last thing I did want to say, I point this out in my report, but I wanted to also say it publicly, is to I posted it in the chat, but at the time of this investigation, the bias-free policing policy was still the same as it was when we reviewed that investigation with the accidental death. And the issue that we took with the policy at the time was that it did not include instances where an officer failed to take an action. So it had to be an action, a proactive action taken on behalf of the officer in some enumerated bias way. And we felt that the spirit of the policy encompassed inaction, but the words of the policy didn't reflect that. And so for that reason, in that case, we sustained and OPR did not sustain. As a result of the conversations that we had in that investigation, I did want to commend ACPD for changing the policy, and the updated policy is cited in my report and also in the chat. I didn't apply that policy to my analysis here because it wasn't in place at the time of this investigation. And I don't reach a necessarily official finding on the bias-free policing policy because it wasn't what we investigated in this case. But I did want to point out that the new policy has like a catch-all phrase that includes inactions and any sort of police interaction that I think will allow us to take a broader look in application into this policy. So I just wanted to commend the police department on taking that recommendation and implementing it into the policy.
Yeah, I think we can definitely also get into that more. We do have a slide on the bias-free policing and our kind of consideration and analysis. But going to what you're saying about the what and the why, you know, going from the why into the what, looking at preliminary and follow-up investigations. Dave, I think you're sharing maybe a different view than, sorry, it's my fault. I interrupted the flow of
I'm
our
not sure.
screen
Well,
sharing.
Yeah,
Try
honestly,
minimizing that window. All right, everyone.
okay. I don't know what happened.
Sorry.
There you go.
Is that so? You guys aren't seeing the slides anymore, right?
When you click share, you should
Correct.
be able to pick a window or a screen that you want to display. Looking at the preliminary and follow-up investigations policy excerpt, Joshua, I'm just going to read this while Dave gets it up. But you know,
Can you guys see that?
Not
No.
yet.
No? You know what? I'm sorry. I may
That's
not
okay.
be.
I just sent them to you if you could take them over. We're on slide 15. So looking at complete and thorough investigations, you know, being criminal to the criminal investigative process, hinge on the quality and accuracy of gathered information. Investigations involve a total police effort and must be conducted within the framework of the U.S. Constitution. All investigations will be guided by the facts and conducted impartially and without bias towards involved parties. The means and resources utilized by the department shall be appropriate to the specific needs of the investigation and the seriousness of the offense. So OPR in this instance exonerated Officer 1 for preliminary and follow-up. Mummy, as you know, for the reasons she described, sustained this allegation. And Joshua, I'm sort of with you. I sort of leaned more, back towards Mummy's conclusion here that given the special training of, a special victims unit detective, right? And given the seriousness of the crime, that while their supervisor endorsed their position or conclusion, the amount of information that was shared with the supervisor to come to that conclusion, I mean, I still think like I'm not calling them back is not a good enough, kind of bar to get there. But I think when we're talking about folks in specialized roles, I think it's reasonable to expect that, officers would have the um, knowledge and inclination to gather more information and stick with it. So Mummy's almost got this up on slide 15. Joshua?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Yeah, I don't want to belabor this point because it's Julie kind of referenced. We talked kind of through it before. You heard, of course, Mummy's rationale, and frankly, Dave made a lot of the points kind of walking through. I think that the way kind of we were even thinking about what you could do, and that seemingly wasn't done, and who's kind of responsible for it. To Julie's point, I think that for me, still the main debate, right, the one that's is again like who owns the accountability here? Is it really both or is it one? And to your point, I think that it's kind of two ways to kind of look at it, or not really two ways to look at it. Two elements to consider as a better way to put it, which is one, to your point, the kind of specialist nature of the role. How much is on you as kind of the first officer and detective there to do the first step of the process? And then two, when you're not sure, you encounter an obstacle, how comprehensively you share with a supervisor and say, hey, it's one thing to say, hey, I'm on a start. I hit a sticking point, or we could have a problem. Here's my situation. Um, I think I want to do this. Are you okay with that? And I think in those circumstances, if a supervisor says to you, no, I hear it, I see all the pieces, and I think that you did it right. Um, I'm under those circumstances inclined to say that Officer One, if that was the circumstance, would be not sustained here because you kind of did your diligence with checking, of course, with your supervisor to verify and get an endorsement of your actions. And there's plenty of course, careers out there, especially with like licensed or professional individuals. And of course, the most one I'm familiar with is law from training. But for legal staff, associates, attorneys, you could always go to kind of your higher level supervisor explaining to you like an ethical or other kind of code kind of issue that you have. But you have to be truthful and you have to be comprehensive. And you have to say, like, this is the issue, and then them endorsing you or even saying, hey, you're wrong, you're totally fine, don't worry about that, just close the case, we'll give you the cover you need. But I think that's the question here is whether we, or from what we can see, are convinced that Officer One gave Officer Two the opportunity to really, have the full view and correct them if they went awry, or whether they were like, hey, this person got mad with me. I'm just saying they may be a little bit angry. So if you see something, don't get me in trouble, which is a different thing, right? And that's not, of course, what you're really looking for is an endorsement of your activities. What you're looking to do is cover yourself in case somebody complains, which they ended up doing. So I think that's the one question out for me, which is why I think that the way that at least Jill and I were initially inclined to this is reasonable. I think the Mummy's is reasonable. I think with the email we got literally yesterday, I'm describing kind of more what we believe was communicated to Officer Two, the supervisory officer, does lead me to Julie's point a little bit back more to sustain. But I will not go into the details for the investigations because, again, I think that Dave covered that at length and other people too, which again, I think that the question really here isn't should more have been done. It's who owns the accountability for the lack of what was done. But that's the way that it goes in my head right now. So that's all I wanted to put in the gloss there.
Thanks, Joshua. I mean, and this is one of the many reasons I'm glad that we have, the broader group for discourse, because I'm a little bit torn here. And so I'm eager to hear, how this lands with the group. And if you feel like you have enough information to kind of jump in on this analysis, and then we can ruminate, on it until we vote at the next meeting. But, given the lack of information sharing and kind of a special victims unit, right? I tend towards feeling like this maybe should be sustained. Group, oh, Mummy.
Sorry, real quick, I just wanted to make sure that people can see the slideshow.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And then one quick point I also wanted to make, because in ACPD's absence, I had a lot of internal conversations with OPR about this matter, and I feel confident in representing that, OPR, at least in my conversations with them, did not feel that this investigation was done to the best of its ability on behalf of Officer One. I think the turning point from their end of the analysis was that the detective went to the supervisor and the supervisor signed off on it. And so that absolved the first officer of their responsibility. And I disagree with that for the reasons I stated at the beginning, but I did want to make sure in their absence that I represented that this was not a blanket, A+ or rubber stamp on the underlying criminal investigation that the officer did from my conversations with them. But I think it is part of honestly, this is part of a larger systemic issue because so many people could have done something here in terms of approaching this differently. It's a larger conversation about the type of training and education, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in the recommendations, but I really want to underscore the supervisory piece here that continues to be missing in this analysis. That you cannot say the supervisor was the one who was responsible, but then not hold the supervisor responsible. So that's all I'll say there.
If I can go next, Mummy, it's super helpful to hear the sort of feedback from the ACPD because what I was most struck by, and I'm a rape crisis counselor, and so the thing that struck me the most was reading the OPR report. And I really struggled with the tone of the report. Dave already gave some of the examples, but like in the quote where the supervising officer said he believes the report should never have been taken by the telephone reporting unit, given that on its face, the allegation is not a crime. And that kind of statement repeated throughout the document. It also said no crime had occurred. There's a lot of effort in the report to talk about how experienced Officer One is, and it doesn't ask her for her experience. It attributes that she must have had a lot of training, so she knew how to speak to an alleged victim. But it doesn't actually go and ask her those questions. It basically says, since she's an officer, she knows how to do this. And then the report spent a full paragraph devoted to questioning the credibility of the complainant. Some of the things it said was, these are some quotes on editorializing, when she and blank finally separated, she had multiple opportunities to seek assistance, yet she declined to do so. She waited for nearly 2 years. Like, it seemed like the whole effort was to make the officer look like she knew what she was doing, and of course she was right, and to cast doubt on the credibility of the alleged victim of this, or the complainant. So I would really ask, and it's too bad that ACPD isn't here, because I think there's a significant bias problem in how they approach writing that report. I haven't had an opportunity to review all the materials because I got them really late, but I certainly would sustain based upon what I read in the OPR report.
I agree with that 100%. And that was the feedback, sorry, that I gave OPR as well, that the report did not reflect the tone that I heard in our internal conversations and our, what did you learn from this investigation and what are we going to do moving forward? And some other things that I cited in my report that I found to be an issue was the characterization of the victim as uncooperative. I would have hung up the phone too if I felt the way that she felt she was being received. And that does not absolve. It was a missed opportunity for them to follow up and to demonstrate professionalism and customer service. But to point to that as her being uncooperative and a reason why no follow-up, that the ability to follow up was eliminated, I think was the quote that I wrote in my report. I think it is, as you said, it kind of, it it casts the conversation in a different way that I think gives a tone that does not reflect objectivity, right? Like the focus here should be on the actions and the conduct of the officer, not the complainant, as a way to mitigate the responsibility of the officer. And aside from just objectivity, um, it doesn't it doesn't underscore the point of what we're doing here, which is to uphold policy and to amplify and illustrate the expectations that we want to be communicating as far as what we want our officers to do in these sort of circumstances, if we're focusing the conversation on the complainant and not on the officer.
Yeah, and one thing just to magnify there, I mean, given that our conversation started, for this meeting in general, that, there are instances where the law sort of needs to catch up. But in this instance, marital rape, for example, as a way of reflecting that the courts register that just because you have participated in consensual sex with somebody before, or, in these instances, that does not absolve, the responsibility to maintain consent. But also that, well, I lost my train of thought, but, that in this instance, the statute of limitations, right? That like, there are reasons why there's not a statute of limitations, for reporting rape, part of that being, because we know that victims underreport and that it can take time to be able to process and feel comfortable or confident interacting with law enforcement and exposing yourself to that vulnerability. But also that the outstanding risk to the public of people who commit violent crimes and go uninvestigated is high. And so, Selena, I like your kind of framing here and registering that, there is not only not the information that we're looking for here, but there is a lot of information that the way we're handling these cases, presuming that no rape took place here without really corroborating any of the facts, is part of why the accountability for lack of follow-up on this investigation is important.
Maybe just to add to that also, I don't think they ever detailed the elements of the crime and went through and showed that those weren't met. Like, I was looking the whole way through of like, what is the statutory like meaning of consent? And like they just said there was none. There was no crime that took place repeatedly, but never considered whether there had been a crime.
Yeah, absolutely. Do other members have, reflections or questions here for preliminary and follow-up investigations? And again, since we're not going to vote tonight, we can kind of carry on with the discussion if we need to and circle back.
I'll add one final point that I found interesting, which was, without getting into the specifics, the communication from the partner that's been alluded to the next day after the event, that at some point ACPD had. It wasn't clear from my understanding of the interview with Officer One whether Officer One had that at the time that she called the complaining witness. I don't think she did, but maybe she did. She didn't remember if she did. She clearly had made up her mind. And when she reviewed the communication from the partner the next day, it said, well, it didn't change anything because it, in her view, was not an admission of rape, which the complainant had characterized it as an admission of rape. The complainant's characterization is irrelevant, but Officer One did read out loud during the investigation some of the text of that communication. And without getting into the specifics, in the text of the communication, the alleged perpetrator said he might have. I mean, literally, without using the same words, he said maybe, like, I wasn't sure, maybe. I mean, it wasn't an admission, but it was very equivocal, and it cried out for additional investigation. I mean, literally, the person who had unsolicitedly, apparently, written to the complaining, the victim, the next day, said, maybe I hurt you in some way. That calls out for investigation. I mean, it just does. So that's one more thing that, to my mind, leads to a sustained sustaining that this was not a fully appropriate follow-up investigation.
Thank you, Dave. That's helpful. Do other folks have questions or comments from the COB before we go into supervisory responsibilities?
I don't have a question, but probably my comment is a good segue for us moving into the supervisory responsibilities, because I was going to say that I didn't really see the dichotomy of it. I saw that two things can be true. It's not an either or, or in that sense, I did see the dichotomy, I should say, that two things could be true, and that when it comes to, in my point of view, an officer and a supervisory officer responsibility, the officer is responsible for execution quality, and you kind of look through that duty of due diligence lens. You're looking at did they fail to flag uncertainties or risk? Was anything withheld? These are things that we touched on, or relevant information not gathered. Or to put it kind of more broadly, did they just fail a reasonable standard? And that's something that we all have been nodding at. And then looking at the supervisor's role, really that responsibility is about being responsible for the decision quality and the oversight. And as opposed to a duty of due diligence, there I see it as a duty of judgment, and did you interrogate those assumptions that were presented to you? Did you, ask if there were any uncertainties there, that if something could be missing or something like that? Did you treat an incomplete analysis as a definitive, interpretation of everything that was there? These are just kind of all the things that we hinted at. So I didn't see it as though if you chose one person failing in the role, then you had to then exonerate the other. That there is enough space for two people to have failed in what they were meant to do, because they both had two different sets of responsibilities in that situation.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. Thank you, Charles. I think it's also worth commenting that, to Mummy's point, like the supervisory responsibilities here were not investigated. So we have some questions that were asked of the supervisor during the, interview, but because they were not regarded as a subject officer, that sort of incomplete perspective is one thing, but given the information that we know the supervisor did and didn't have, right? Like, even though they didn't have necessarily this full picture, when we're going to like some of the language in preliminary and followed, like the seriousness of this crime, the Mummy to kind of cite what you were talking about in the email from Officer 1 to the supervisor, that there's this sort of declarative, statement that doesn't seem to comport with, a level of uncooperation or credibility that should have stopped, the officer's curiosity about, getting additional information and follow up.
If we do take Charles up on his attempt to kind of just ease us into the supervisory, actually on the next slide, I think that a good point to be made there, right, is to recap 2 points that both of you already made. First, kind of what Charles is saying, which is, of course, there's no preclusive, like it is not necessary, right? If one person is responsible, then the other person is not responsible because of what he said, the kind of different duties. And then to put that together with what Mummy was saying, how me ever, if your rationale as OPR is that there is no problem exonerating for Officer 1 because you went to your supervisor and you were blessed and endorsed. So we can't hold you responsible because you at least went to your supervisor and you're blessed and endorsed. And yet OPR is saying this maybe was not the gold standard for how we investigated. I don't know how you don't look at Officer 2 as a subject officer. So the fact that we've already talked about that wasn't investigated, but to me, that's a good indication that you're like, look, we're not saying there's a failing there. We're saying that the failing wasn't Officer 1's, but we're not going to look at anybody else. And that's a little weird to me. So that's, just putting that together. And again, I think many of you kind of said it before, you see the relevant policy excerpt here, excuse me, here, accountable for performance of employees. It goes into kind of what Charles was saying, which is a different kind of responsibility. This is not to say a supervisory officer is responsible in the same way, in the same manner that the people they supervise are. But, you know, the buck has to stop somewhere. And to your point, the quality of the decision or the judgment, I think is what you phrased it as, which is a good way to put it, is kind of what's going on there. And again, to reiterate what kind of Dave said, right, and we've heard that before, I think that that's why, you know, obviously you see, I don't know if it's the next slide or not, you see kind of the OPR, you know, didn't investigate. You see that Mummy recommends sustaining. We also, Joy and I recommend sustaining for a lot of the reasons you guys are already heard here today, which is when you come down to it, says, no, you're right, we can close that out. And, you know, that should have never been taken. And there's a lot of like, look, you were maybe not told everything as a supervisory officer, but you were told enough to know that maybe more could have been done. And whether that's to Julia's earlier point, this interaction did not go stellar. And maybe this person's a little upset. So maybe we get one of your colleagues on the phone to reach out after a day or two, or maybe I'll reach out after a day or two, or, you know, whatever it is to know that there's something here, but to say, no, you're right, uncooperative with people. And, you know, it's also just funny as a, you know, an unrefuted factoid here that the complainant themselves filed a complaint and said it took multiple weeks for me to get in contact with the detective. Hey, what are the next steps? That doesn't really sound like an uncooperative witness. That sounds like you have a ready and willing witness, which you're going to need in these kind of cases. To Dave's point, this is a hard case to prove, but it's like, cool, you have one. They're like, nah, she was mad at me when I told her I wasn't going to investigate anymore. And I was like, okay. But you know, that's kind of what we're left with here. So just piecing together things that everybody already said. I don't want to belabor it too much. And I see Julie has something to say anyway, but that was why our recommendation was to stay for supervisory, because we thought there was enough here, even looking from that kind of different dichotomy that Charles laid out, the duty standpoint here, that the supervisor kind of should have known better and should have known to do something else and re-educate that person, Officer One, as to what else they could do, or something else that he could have done personally as a supervisor.
Yeah. The only thing I wanted to add to your analysis is just a reminder, and again, since ACPD isn't here, we want to be even-handed and, you know, handling their analysis of this. And, you know, we've talked a lot about the difference between saying what could have gone better or what we would like to have seen versus could a qualified officer have reasonably come to the same conclusion here? And given the training of, you know, a special victims unit, whether it's the detective or the supervisor, I do think that if you're qualified to investigate these cases, you would not reasonably conclude that no crime occurred here from the amount of information that we have, that it would take more information to conclude that no crime occurred, or more relevant contradictions in order to actually like undermine the victim's credibility. And so just making sure that, you know, as we're thinking about sustained versus not sustained versus exonerated, you know, yes, there are often a lot of things that we wish would have happened better, but our standard here is could another qualified officer reasonably have come to the same conclusion? And in this instance, like, you know, the ones we've already talked about, I don't see it that way. I think a qualified officer would reasonably have pursued you know, the investigation further, and a reasonably qualified supervisor would have done more due diligence with regard to follow-up, because that's something ACPD, again, has said in these meetings, that when communication breaks down with one officer, you know, a regular de-escalation, you know, best practice, and so that comes from the field, but still, that if communication has broken down, that doesn't mean someone's uncooperative. It means that you might need to try a different approach. So Joshua, I'm going to let you steward the rest of the conversation, walking through the case and our recommendations. And we'll revisit that at the February meeting, but I have to deputize Dave to take over as host for the meeting. And then Mummy, obviously you can help kind of facilitate the discussion and wrap up with IPA update. So I'm sorry to leave, but I don't want to interrupt the discussion too much. So Joshua, if you want to get into bias-free policing, and again, we've got that note here, Mummy, about the policy being updated. I appreciate everyone's kind of thoughtfulness on this and look forward to connecting again in February.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, the the last thing I'll say, right before the bias policing, because it's just something that Julie mentioned. And I think that, frankly, I think you, Dave, mentioned it before too, which is, a couple of you, have said and indicated and observed, like, hey, they're saying there's not enough here, there's not enough here. It doesn't sound like we don't know where that's coming from. But one kind of my frustrations, and again, I think you alluded to it before, Dave, which is if you have questions about that as a law enforcement entity, you can consult with your Commonwealth Attorney's office, who's ultimately going to be responsible for it. And the fact that that did not occur was a little troubling to me, because they're the ones ultimately that's going to have to, have to prosecute that case. So if they told you, you come to them and say, hey, this is what we got, I'm sure they'd be willing to have that conversation and educate you as to what the law means. All right, the relevant policy language for bias-free policing is another reminder, similar to what we just talked about with supervisory. This one was not investigated by OPR, so this is just one we kind of talked about with Mummy and ourselves as something that has sort of been considered. Dave, you hit on it already with talking about the personal contacts in the last line about bias in that one. And it kind of what led us to this kind of, the consideration here for the bias language. As you see there, departments committed to ensuring law enforcement activities are conducted in a biased manner. You have the definition of bias there, right? And that's important because it says, tendency, inclination, and prejudice, often based on stereotypes rather than actual knowledge of the individual circumstance. And that part really stands out to me because that's what we're kind of missing here, right? When we talk about the tone of the OPR report, or we talk about the investigation or the lack thereof, we don't know where the disclination is coming from so far as the individual circumstances, because the individual circumstances do not appear to be investigated. So we're only left with where else did this, this disclination to kind of go forward and come through it. And then the last one, just to point out there for you guys, that's the most important is, of course, B. It says, based on race, ethnicity, those kind of things like that. But the last clause is or other bias rather than an individual's behavior or other information identifying the individual as having engaged in criminal activity. And again, that individualized basis is important here because that's kind of what we're hanging our hat on, right? And whether it's the actual allegation of what Officer One says that, hey, you stayed in this relationship and thus, no next steps, or it's to say, hey, we're not going to follow up for the reasons that Julie said before, because we have this idea here. But when you look into what Mummy said in the beginning, the dedication of Officer One to assessing the credibility of the complainant, but seemingly not investigating the allegation of the complainant of rape. And then you look again, as we see after the fact, at OPR's report, it shouldn't be a huge surprise. As Mum said, OPR declined to look at the bias-free policing instead using personal contacts. And, that's that decision. But it shouldn't be a terrible surprise that, OPR didn't kind of look down that rabbit hole too, because I do think the bias thing gets a little bit more messy. If you write something off as there was a rude comment that shouldn't have been made, that's a lot easier to deal with. And the idea being, hey, there is this actually underlying bias we have to address, and whether it's because somebody stayed or what the person they're out alleging is, or whether it's because the nature of the sexual activity that's alleged here, or whatever it is. The idea being that we can say, hey, this is not something that we have to deal with because look at all the other kind of interactions they've had with law enforcement. This person isn't trustworthy. Again, as Julia said in the beginning, you could tell a police department three different facts or allegations. Two of them could be false. But if one of them is true and it's an alleged crime, then you investigate the alleged crime, and it doesn't mean you have to ignore that as a police department, the credibility determination, but it shouldn't be enough to negate and just to write off and not investigate. And that's kind of what we saw there. So again, a lot of this conversation is piecing together already what many of you have already said. But that last line that they pointed out in kind of the personal contacts kind of feeds into this relevant policy language. And as Mummy already said, and there's a note at the bottom, this policy has been updated, but we're using the old version because the facts of this underlying complaint happened at the time of the old policy. But we think it's sufficient that it should have been able to look at it. Now, Julie and I didn't reach any conclusions so far as recommendations of violation of this policy. Just because the fact that it was investigated, unlike the supervisory bit where we actually have quite a few facts as to what the supervisor did or did not do, we don't have really anything here besides kind of what we already talked about and alluded to. Now, that doesn't mean there couldn't be enough of a recommendation to sustain, but we simply just felt that because OPR didn't look at it, we didn't really have any facts that goes into it, and because we haven't really developed this policy's usage enough, frankly, that probably should, start being used to actually identify it, that we didn't feel that we had enough to make a conclusion. But I'll just stop there, let Mummy add her pieces on it, and then hopefully get some of your guys' thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think I explained a lot of my kind of rationale early on this, jumped the gun a little bit. So I won't repeat that, but one thing I did want to say is that, I just want to underscore that there are differences in bias, and that for all we know, especially for someone who has been working in SVU for all this time, like I'm not making the assumption here that this was a bias that was even necessarily intentionally being casted on the complainant, right? Like there's a lot of times in these instances, like the case that we cited to earlier, where we are picking up on some perhaps implicit biases. And so this is not as, it's meant to be a, punitive discussion or an indictment on the particular officer when we talk about bias. And I just want to continue to underscore that, because I think part of it, as you said, Joshua, is like it's easier to, the reason why we don't often go down this line of inquiries because of the implications of what it might mean. And so I think that there needs to be some differences in the articulation of the policy, and then also the consequences, I guess, if you will, of a sustained violation when there is, it's something's more indicative of maybe an implicit bias. I think that is where all around here, what was glaring to me in this investigation is not just for Officer One, but for the entire department, there needed to be better education around withdrawn consent, around intimate partner relationships, BDSM relationships, all these nuances that I think are at the heart of the bias. It's more about education and maybe not having the appropriate level of sensitivity to this particular type of nuanced issue than me being able to draw the conclusion beyond a preponderance of the evidence that this officer, intended to purposely treat this person differently because of their underlying, sexual relationship or intimate relationship. So I just want to say that when we talk about bias, we are not meaning to draw an inference in one particular way, and that there are nuances even to bias and how we should be approaching those conversations and how we treat those conversations. It's very different to me than someone who is intentionally displaying discriminatory behavior, which should be treated entirely differently.
Yeah, can I just add briefly to that, which is, this is a longer conversation that I know we'd like to have with ACPD, because right now the way the consequences that flow from a finding of a biased police policy violation is very severe. And on one hand, I feel, okay, good, I'm glad that ACPD takes it that seriously, but it's prohibited the value it's limited the value to literally, we've never seen a case of someone who is intentionally, discriminating against somebody. And as Mummy said, there are all these other levels of bias that, like what happened in this case and what happened we referred to another case where there was a lack of investigation from a homeless individual. And the bias was, the guy doesn't have any relatives, he's homeless. Actually, he did have relatives and they were very concerned. And so those kind of things I would like to see lead to not punitive, but education and training. Like if we could, again, far longer term thing, but create an implicit bias policy that would not lead to discipline other than training. Like if someone intentionally has racial or sexual or other, and intentionally takes action, yeah, I think they should be either relieved of duty or severely disciplined or whatever. But we haven't seen that, fortunately. What we see are all this sort of lesser implicit, maybe unconscious bias, but it's serious because, as we said at the beginning, we don't know. Like the guy who is the alleged perpetrator in this case, he may be a bad guy. I mean, he may have committed other crimes. I mean, and this case wasn't investigated. So we don't know. I think there's value to having an implicit bias policy that can lead to training and is not the violation of which is not considered so severe that the ACPD is reluctant to find people in violation of it. I think if it leads to better education and training, that's the point. That's what we're trying to do here. So that's it.
Yeah, and without without actually investigating this allegation and asking the right questions to unpack the bias and the root of the bias, we don't know if it's an intentional or an implicit bias. Sometimes they show up similarly, but when you unpack the root of them, you get to a different result. So I'm not making a finding one way or another of what it was behind it, what the why behind the why was, but I definitely think that we could interrogate this a lot more.
Does anybody else have anything? I know this is the bias-free policing is kind of the last element we talked about, and I think that a lot of those points that I'm sympathetic to hear, and I was glad to hear from kind of Dave said, right, is that ultimately I think the problem we've seen with bias policing, more of you, than a lot longer here than I have, and I've seen come up a couple of times. Just to the point, you can't make a policy that is so punitive that you're just never going to use it. Because I'm like, well, it's like we created a lovely policy that's a nice mission statement you put on the wall and nobody actually uses. And that's what we not want to hear because as everybody said, as Julie said, as Mumia said, as Davis now said, it's like everybody's point here. We're a community oversight board that looks at things that come to us and we want to try to make things better. So things, go better in the future. That is all we're looking to do. And we have recommendations. They're non-binding recommendations. It's really about a feedback loop and trust between the community and an ACPD, and that's really what we all want. You see the disciplinary sufficiency slide, and so here you see, of course, OPR's considerations. We talked about kind of what they decided, kind of through the violations. Again, the 2 violations they considered for Officer 1 only were the personal contacts, and of course the failure preliminary investigation, right? And they said no, not sustained so far as personal contacts. They've said exonerated for, of course, the preliminary investigation, and thus because there was no violations, no discipline, right? The COB assessment, as recommended by Julian ourselves, and is kind of echoed, frankly, by Dave's sentiment here, is that really what we would like to see is training and education, right? Because what we're talking about here, these kind of failures, it's like these are easy failures, but there's multiple points of failure here. And I think Mummy said it before that there was multiple opportunities for one person to be like, we could do something else, or this could be done better, right? Or, let's just take this a little bit more seriously, or, hey, where are you getting that that's not a thing? Or, based on what you're saying, that this doesn't meet an element, or maybe we check with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, get their read on just anything, one of those things. That, I think that training this area, especially with wrong consent, as we talked about, can be very educational in this category. We see the relevant officer recommendations. Again, the additional training for bias and sexual assault related training. Again, that bias, whether implicit or actually invidious or discriminatory in effect, we just don't want bias. It's hard. We all have biases, but the consequences, frankly, when you're an ACP, sometimes are more severe than when you and I have bias. Frankly, to your point, people would think, as the case that Dave referenced, oh, they're a homeless person. Nobody cares. Not true. And you're like, oh, and then you have family members show up. And so it's just being able to educate ourselves enough, and then ACPD being able to educate themselves. And hey, if they say need the resources, we'd love to be partners with them and getting them the resources, right? To just make sure that you do have the education and knowledge base to say, you know what, maybe there's nothing here, but let's check, and that's kind of what you want to do. And then the last thing we see here is the supervisor merits for the discipline to be held accountable for failure properly guided Officer 1 and follow up in that investigation. That language may be a little bit changed, as you heard, Julie and I kind of go back and forth on how we think the responsibility so far as Officer 1's conduct in the preliminary investigation is. However, still for supervisory, we think that one thing you shouldn't be telling your Officer 1s in this scenario is, oh, don't worry about it. They should maybe even taken the call. Things like that. So there's still accountability that needs to flow there. It's a question now of now with kind of the new knowledge we had on Monday about the communications between Officer 1 and 2, what the supervisor, so far as marriage discipline, for to be held accountable for which failure, Officer 1. Is it their failure to actually just not actually do their due diligence, as kind of Charles put it, diligence, or is it the judgment call that you made to say, hey, this is fine, don't worry about it because this doesn't matter anyway. And so those would be kind of the recaps there, and at least how Julie and I were thinking about it so far as a disciplinary sufficiency from this angle.
I don't have anything to add in terms of discipline other than I also felt it was insufficient because I think the allegation should have been sustained. On the topic of recommendations, I +1 everything you said as well. I did also make recommendations that the department as a whole, but particularly these sort of specialized units, needs to implement in policy a protocol similar to how we have the next of kin, right? So in that instance, supervisors did not have to sign off before an order went to the county attorney's office to have a body that was unclaimed go through a cremation process. That is no longer the case. It now has to be reviewed by a supervisor. So similarly, I made the recommendation that a substantive review should be done in these cases before a matter is closed out. And that there also should be a consultation with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office to ensure that all avenues have been pursued. And then I did make recommendations both in my report and in my conversation with OPR related to some of the things we discussed about the tone. I think the nuance here, because I did not feel that the tone of the report mirrored the receptiveness or the conversations that I had with OPR, who were receptive to all of the recommendations that we made as far as training and different things of that nature. I think the nuances, they are in quoting, I guess, if you will, or paraphrasing the sentiments of the detective and the supervising officer, adopting that same tone by not differentiating themselves from that and making it explicit that they had a different perspective or that they were interrogating, even if it wasn't a wholly different perspective in terms of the outcome. Some of the things that were said, like the statement from the supervising officer that they shouldn't have even taken the report, which is just a jarring statement in and of itself. And saying things like, repeating the language about the person being uncooperative. So just being mindful of how that can communicate a certain tone, because I think an objective person reading that report would think that you too have that same sentiment. So if that's not the sentiment of, OPR, that is clearly laid out in the report, and honestly that their findings should reflect that. That's another conversation, or a conversation that we've been having all night long. And so, but I do think that you can have common ground on what are some of the issues in a case while reaching different findings. And the objective here is not necessarily always to agree on the findings, but to agree on what did we learn here and what are the next steps that we're going to implement to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So I am hopeful that we can continue these discussions and implement some additional policy changes in this area. One other recommendation that I made to them was that there are a lot of times actions that are taken after an investigation is concluded before even a report is done, or that are not necessarily highlighted in the OPR report. And so to the extent that that may not be part of the official findings or what have you, I think it is important, and I've encouraged them to document what steps that they took, whether it was counseling a particular officer, whether it was giving an officer training. Like, we never necessarily know unless I explicitly ask, like, what happened after the fact? What did you do? What did you change? And I think that is a missed opportunity for them to demonstrate how they've internalized some of the discussions that we've had even leading up to these meetings. And so I hope that those efforts are reflected in reports moving forward, because I think that leads to especially when you have so much time between when the investigation happened and when we're having these discussions, it can lead to a more productive dialogue if we know that certain measures have been taken and we can give input on, the progress that's been made instead of what hasn't been done. So I'll end there.
I say, and can you just go to the last slide of this? Because I think that, that pretty much wraps up, of course, this kind of, I think it's the concerns one, the COB concerns slide. Is that, thank you. And so a lot of what people have said here, right, is kind of reflected in what kind of Julie and I came up with so far as the concerns that we identified. You'll see there the fourth one, right, the tone of the OPR report, which many of us and we just talked about again. To me, it was like even the devil's in the details. I think like Selena, you mentioned a lot of good ones that kind of stood out to you. To me, it was kind of the whole part of quality and cooperative and phrasing that light. But even the little things in terms of, you've identified it as an alleged rape. And then every single time afterwards, rape is in quotation marks. And I'm like, we already said it was alleged. And it's those kind of little passive aggressive things that to me, like that's how I read it. But to your point, it's putting your thumb on the scale, which goes full circle back into bias conversation and things that are, things that we should probably watch out for. But I wrote PPs here. I just wanted you to see the slide and know that a lot of the things that I heard, at least today, I think are reflected in the other concerns we had wider about the report. But that'll be, I think, it for my input, at least on the actual investigation part of it.
To that, if I could,
Yeah, sir, I wanted
if I
to
could
open the
that
floor
last
for
point
comments,
if I could
and then
that
we'll go to
last
public
point,
comments.
if I could that last point that Josh made, because I think that is something as maybe a side project or something that we as a COB need to be mindful of, and that we have seen some improvement. So I kind of put the question then to you, Mommy, as I framing this. So earlier, when we were looking at these reports from OPR, a lot of our focus was on OPR interviews and how they were conducted, things like leading versus non-leading questions. And I'm curious over time how you feel those practices have improved or changed, but now more particularly to the other end of the questioning is the reports. So going to what Joshua was saying and relate to that, is there also some discussion that we can have the COB, some recommendations we can have on the writing side regarding tone, voice, how investigative reports are framed? So not in terms of like outcomes, but how facts and inferences and conclusions are distinguished. How, what are your thoughts on how that side of the house has evolved and what more COB can or should do to inform that part of the process too?
I definitely think in terms of the questions, that there has been significant improvement in that area. And I think a lot of that is because of the fact that I'm participating live in these interviews and having them ask follow-up questions and that sort of thing. And that is although I'm not directly in the room, like the questions that I'm asking are being fielded directly to the officer. So I think that's part of it. So just that the institutionalization of like me being in the room. The other piece I would say as far as the reports go is one is that the lieutenants who author these reports are, not always the same, right? Like there are people coming in and out of that. They rotate, people who investigate. And so people have different writing styles, or one person with tenure or seniority might start writing in a way that, is more indicative of what we're asking for. And then someone new comes on and we're kind of starting the ball over again. That being said, I think we should be in a conversation about how we can standardize, some of these issues in the same way that we've standardized questioning. I also think part of it is too that there is a learning curve over time of writing to a different audience, right? Like they were used to writing to themselves and now they're writing to us. And that is different, right? Like we may look at it, the tone of it, the perception of it, completely differently than what they think is being communicated in the tone, whether it's passively or directly adopting, particular language. And so I think that this is a work in progress, certainly, but I think the more we have these conversations, the more we document these recommendations in our reports, and work collaboratively to create some standards and protocols. Maybe there is some educational workshops or trainings or things that we can do to help kind of address some of these nuances as we talked about with bias, as we talk about with, asking questions and investigating, but also how we are asking questions of officers. I know that part of the whole work that we want to do around bias is just specifically how we're asking questions around it. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area, but I've seen, this has not necessarily been the tone in all of the OPR reports that I've read, but some have been better than others. But I definitely think that we've given a lot of substantive feedback about different issues that we've read into some of these reports. And so I think that the point has been made, and I think that they are understanding that we would like to see this information presented a little bit differently, and for me, more extensively, especially the after the fact part.
Thank you.
Are we at a point in the meeting where we would go to your update, Mummy?
First, I just wanted to make sure that there were no other questions or comments for discussion from any of the COB members or any of our elected officials. And then we should ask if there's is any public comment that anyone wants to give. And then we can quickly go to my updates, which I will keep very brief. And then I think we can adjourn at that point. So first,
I was going to say, can we just clarify like what time we're ending? Because I have a dog that really needs to go out.
We can take a 10-minute break if y'all want to before we, go to any comments and then adjourn. Or 5 minutes even, however long. Or do y'all want to push through?
My guess is we're pretty close to adjourning. And why don't we ask if there's anybody here that from the public who would like to comment? If so, just raise your hand.
I don't see any hands.
All right. Well, for now, it doesn't appear that there's any public comment.
Okay.
So JD or Susan, would you like to add anything? Make any comments?
No, just keep, for me, I'm good. Thanks.
Same. Thank you all for a thoughtful review and conversation, and look forward to continuing to support improvements.
Thanks. So I guess, Mommy, it's up to you. You have the floor then for an update.
All right, in 10 seconds or less. Just wanted to provide an update that we are deep into the traffic stop data analysis that's still ongoing. We have received at this point a kind of draft of some policy and training recommendations from CNA, who is our consultant in the matter. So we're going through those recommendations, and then they will start providing us with the data reports. And so I just wanted to provide an update that that's still ongoing. Now that we have Ethan on board, I am planning to continue my quarterly reports. So you should expect that at the end of the quarter. Or resume those. And just as a reminder, I think you all know, we talked about in the beginning, we are approaching a legislative session. And so, expect some updates from me about the things that I think you saw the kind of, recommendations that I made on our behalf of what we wanted to see happen legislatively. So I will do my best to keep you as up to date in the moment of what's going on. It's fast moving. So I will try to keep up and let you guys know what's going on with that. And then just be aware that budget season is approaching. And so we will want to engage with folks on that. But I did send out a email with what I proposed to the county manager for our budget related to operating expenses and staffing. So just look for that in email. And if you have any questions or comments or want to provide any feedback to the county manager or the county board, just let me know and I'll make sure to make those connections. And that's it.
The last thing I'll add, excuse me, is that we, and we've mentioned this before, we have engaged Rachel. How do you pronounce her last name? I can't pronounce her last name. I'm not sure what it is, but Rachel, who's been very helpful, is helping us draft reports from prior cases that we've had public discussions about and made recommendations about. So we are in the process of clearing the backlog of those reports, and we'll continue to do so. And I think unless there's any further open discussion, that we can adjourn the meeting. So let's call it adjourned.
You take a motion or you just go ahead and adjourn? It's okay. Good to go.
I don't think we've
As I
taken
said.
motions.
Okay,
If you've
good.
completed all of the agenda items, you don't have to. You can just declare the meeting adjourned. And I think you have.
Oh, yeah. Everyone does a little
Uh,
different. Okay, have a great one. See you next month. Bye.
All
Thank
right.
y'all.
Thank you, everybody. Good
Bye,
seeing
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
everybody.
Bye-bye.